Okay, guys, this slide deals with Lyndon Baines Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's vice president and becomes president when Kennedy is killed. And let me turn your attention here to the top corner. Very famous photo here. This is President Johnson being sworn in aboard Air Force One in Dallas. When Kennedy died at the hospital in Dallas, President Johnson was with him on the trip because he's from Texas. He was a senator from Texas, so he had kind of gone back home for the campaign trip. Before taking off to fly back to Washington, D.C., they grab a judge, a local judge in Dallas. This is her right here. They find a Bible and they swear in Lyndon Johnson as the next president of the United States on board Air Force One. This is President Johnson's wife right here. This is President Kennedy's wife here, the widow now, Jackie Kennedy. She came back to the plane here for the flight back to D.C. And was there when President Johnson was sworn in. Now, one of the first things that President Johnson will do early on in 1964 is to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a major piece of legislation. Kennedy was committed to civil rights. Johnson, even though he's a Southerner, is going to be committed to continuing Kennedy's work on civil rights. A lot of people were unsure how Johnson was going to handle this, but Johnson does more for civil rights than many other presidents before him had certainly could have done. So, three things here you need to know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Number one, it bans racial discrimination in private facilities open to the public. Now, I'll say that a couple times. It bans racial discrimination in private facilities open to the public, like theaters, hospitals, restaurants, museums, things like that. They're private, but they're open to the public. So, it will make racial discrimination illegal in those places. Number two, it will strengthen the federal government's power to end segregation in schools. Strengthens the federal government's power to end segregation in schools. Remember, we're now 10 years after Roe v. Wade, and schools are not being integrated. So this will give the federal government more power to make sure they start integrating. Right? And number three, right, it prevents employers from discriminating based on race in hiring. So you can't refuse to hire somebody because of their race. If you do, you can be cut off from federal funding, meaning any sort of bank loan. And all businesses need bank loans. So if you'd like to keep getting money from the federal government, you cannot discriminate based on race in hiring. This is a huge deal. Kennedy was going to sign this. Dr. King had been working and working to get this passed. And when Kennedy died, everybody was wondering, maybe all that's for nothing now. We have a Southerner in the White House. But Johnson continues, even expands Kennedy's civil rights work. Okay. If you'll recall, Kennedy's domestic program was called the New Frontier, and we're not sure exactly how good that would have been. Kennedy's killed before he can really do much with it. So we're left with President Johnson. President Johnson's program, his domestic policy, will be known as the Great Society, and it will focus on a war on poverty. Johnson goes on TV and declares an unconditional war on poverty in America, particularly in the Appalachian region, so eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, those areas. But Johnson's going to go after poverty in this country. He says it's unforgivable that in the wealthiest nation on the planet that as many people should be poor as are. So the Great Society will focus on poverty. Okay? Johnson will create two new cabinet offices, like cabinet departments. We get the Department of Transportation, formed under President Johnson. Technology has increased, air travel. Eisenhower built the interstate highway system and all that. We need a separate department to oversee the safety of all of those things. So the Department of Transportation will be created, as will the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Since it's Housing Urban Development, it's typically just known as HUD, H-U-D, HUD. And we see a first here for Johnson. The first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development will be a man named Robert Weaver. And that is significant because he is the first black cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Robert Weaver, the first black cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Now, one of Johnson's proudest accomplishments is what's known as VISTA, okay? Or sometimes it's known as AmeriCorps. Okay? VISTA stands for Volunteers in Service to America. Volunteers in Service to America. And the easiest way to describe this is it's the domestic, meaning here in the U.S., the domestic version of the Peace Corps. If you think back to Kennedy wanted to send American volunteers around the world. Johnson says, okay, that's great, wonderful, we're going to keep the Peace Corps going, and he does. It's still around today. You can go join the Peace Corps after get out of college if you want to. But Johnson says, well, that's great and all, sending young Americans to volunteer around the world to help them. But what about all the problems we have here in America? Why don't we use young American people to volunteer and help out the poor in America? So, Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA. This is still around today. Okay? It's known more by the name AmeriCorps today, but it's still the same program. Okay? All right, lastly here, most of Johnson's domestic work will center around what he calls the Big Four. These are four main legislative areas, like passing laws. Okay? Now remember, Johnson was a senator. He had a lot of friends in the Senate. A lot of people owed him favors in the Senate. So he's going to be able to get done basically anything he wants to get done. He's got a Democratic Senate, and people owe him favors from his days there. The first area deals with education. Okay? And Johnson will start Head Start. And this ties into his war on poverty. Okay? Kindergarten used to not be free. You had to pay for kindergarten. And what we were finding was that at very young ages, when kids really need to learn to get the basics down, the poorest children in America couldn't afford kindergarten. So by the time they got to first grade, they were already behind other students that had money. So Johnson will found Project Head Start to pay for early childhood education. It'll pay for kindergarten. It'll pay for preschool for the poor so that their children aren't already starting out at a disadvantage. Okay? Second, to help, again, the poor here, in terms of health care, Johnson will found Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare provides health care for the elderly. When you retire, hit 65, and you don't have a monthly income, the government is going to pay for your health care through Medicare. Medicaid will provide health care for the poor. So if you are unemployed, you've lost your job, you can't find a job, you need health care, Medicaid will help pay for that for you. The third area here in Johnson's Big Four is immigration. If you think back to the 1920s, we greatly restricted immigration because we hated immigrants, we didn't like them, they were socialist and all that. Johnson's going to do away with that. Johnson is going to double the number of immigrants that are allowed to enter the United States. And especially, he's going to allow immigrants' children to reunite families. If parents are here, he's going to allow children in to put the family back together. So Johnson's going to open the doors here of America again. They've been closed for quite a while. Johnson's going to open them up. And lastly, the Voting Rights Act will be passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, we talked about this in a civil rights unit there, will ban literacy tests. It gets rid of the literacy test. It also gives the federal government more power to oversee voter registration in the South. Remember, the problem was we couldn't get blacks registered to vote. The federal government's going to come in and make sure they get a chance to register to vote and then vote by getting rid of the literacy tests. Okay? And the 26th Amendment will be passed, which we talked about in terms of Vietnam here, lowering the voting age to 18. If you're old enough to get drafted and go fight, you're old enough to have a say in who's sending you to go fight. All right. Johnson has great plans, and he actually gets quite a bit done. He could have accomplished so much more. Johnson could have been one of our best presidents, in my opinion. But Vietnam ruined him. All these programs, he wants to help the poor, cost a lot of money. And the country was spending billions and billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars every year funding Vietnam. So Johnson kind of got caught in the middle. He couldn't fully fund his Great Society because of Vietnam, and he didn't fully fund Vietnam because he wanted to help people here at home through the Great Society. So Johnson gets caught in the middle. Vietnam destroys him as a president, and we'll see what happens to him as a result here in a couple slides.